opportunity, or you might want to recap. And you'll be able to access a recording shortly after the session. Certainly by the end of tomorrow, I expect you'll find it on the Regulation Hub, the members site of the website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alan Blanchard from TSO, who's going to talk to us and introduce us to the subject of unlocking regulatory information. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Louisa. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to spend the next hour or so with you. I have Charles Oakley with me from the Health and Safety Executive as well. So I will spend about 20 minutes or so explaining what we mean by unlocking regulatory information, and then Charles will give his perspectives from a sort of been there and done it point of view. And then we will have time at the end for questions, hopefully, and we can make it quite a nice interactive session as Louisa says. So we'll go through what the challenge is in terms of this, the regulatory information ecosystem. I'll explain how we make regulations easier to find, use, understand, and apply. I'll also set out something that we put together at TSO, which we call the Pathway to Innovation, which is a good way to sort of map your progress. And then I'll hand over to Charles, and he will explain how he and his team have been there and done it in terms of improving regulatory practice and their compliance activities at the HSE. So let's continue on. So very grateful to Louisa and the team for the sort of basis of this slide. It's one I use all the time just to set out what the regulatory ecosystem looks like on a page, and it's lovely and complex. And we find this to be a particular issue for businesses and people when they need to comply with multiple regulations. So a seemingly straightforward activity or business idea often means that you're interacting with a wide variety of regulators across various different regulatory perimeters. And to get the information that citizen or business needs is often very hard to find and therefore hard to use, especially if you're completely new to a particular area. It's very difficult to say, show me everything that I need to know to be able to start a fish and chip shop or something like this. And if regulation is hard to find and hard to use, then it may as well not exist, right? Because you're running the risk of people carrying on their activities without paying any adherence to the regulations at all, or misinterpreting the regulations and getting it wrong, either to their detriment or the detriment of their customers. So I think it's very important that we address this challenge. So we've sort of summed it up in terms of these four categories of find, use, understand, and apply. And really, I'm going to spend time talking about how regulation can be made easier to find, use, understand, and apply. So when we mean find, what we mean here is that we want to help users to identify what applies to them. And how many of us here today can say, hand on heart, that we as regulators create regulation with end users in mind? Now, if you're doing that, great, that's a big tick in the box. But I think too often is the case that the end user isn't at the forefront of everyone's mind when we're thinking about solving particular policy and supervisory challenges. But we want to enable whatever the regulator does, whatever they output, we want them to be able to meet these user needs. And the regulators need to create regulation in a way that makes it flexible. And if you make your regulation more flexible and more discoverable, then when that regulation is searched for, it's easier to find, first and foremost. So you're giving the citizen, the business owner, at least a standing chance of finding the correct regulation. But we could go even one step further than that, and we could make the information, regulatory information, more like data. And then you can enable it to be ingested and interpreted in the way that data is at the moment. So there's plenty of sort of room for improvement on the finding portion. But when we have been lucky enough to find the regulation that applies to us, when we want to use it, it's often locked up in a PDF. Now, why is that bad? Well, it's inaccessible. It can be out of date. It can be the wrong document. It can be open to too much interpretation. But primarily, first and foremost, you don't have the adequate, let's say, reassurance that what that PDF you're looking at is what you're supposed to be looking at. Let's say it could be too old. It could be not the correct document for you. If we took really that PDF and made the unlocked all the information that was in there, digitized all that information, and made it machine readable and or made it interoperable, so that that first diagram we displayed, all of those different regulators with their regulations can start to interoperate between each other and link back to all the different content overlaps. Then you've got technology supporting you in using that information and making sure that when you ask your regulatory question, you get back the correct answer. So suddenly we have user-focused functionality. We have searching that can search more than one data source at a time. We can link between content much more accurately. We can add in features such as time travel, so you can see previous versions of rules as well as the current version. We might even be able to compare different regulatory regimes side by side. And we can start implementing things like digital twins, where me as a firm, obviously not just a fish and chip shop owner at this point, but me as a firm in a particularly complex regulatory environment can create a digital twin of that environment and start experimenting with what the changes mean in terms of implementing those changes as they're handed down from the regulator. So that's using. Understanding is, here we sort of focused just on three aspects here. So one is guidance. So how can we support the users in helping them interpret what the regulations mean? And if we unlock information out of that PDF, for example, it's easier to create that guidance to sit alongside the relevant portion. If you've got a 40-page PDF, it's quite difficult to write the guidance to say, here's how to comply with the rules that are in there. Whereas if you break that down into smaller components and you have that on a website, suddenly you can interweave the guidance in the correct place within the regulation. So this supports your understanding of that. Also, if it's digitized content, you can start injecting that content into learning resources. So where someone wants to write a e-learning module or something like this to help you with your adoption of these rules, suddenly the rules at source can be injected into these e-learning applications, so that if the rules change over time, the e-learning keeps up with that, because obviously there's a risk that learning materials created to help understand rules and regulations can fall out of date as the rules change over time. And then when we talk about contextualizing information, we're talking about those changes over time. So what applied to me, if there's a query over whether what I did in the past was correct or not, we're able to go back in time with the digital version of the rules and see what the rules were at that time to be sure that what I did was correct, for example. But we can also look at it in terms of what's coming up. So you can go and walk into the future and see what impact that regulatory change has on my business or my activities in the context that I'm interested in. Because obviously not all regulatory change affects everyone in the same way or at the same time. And then finally, when we look at apply, we're talking about tools for implementation. Here we mean chatbots, dashboards, monitoring tools, anything that gives me really what I need to know on a single page as far as possible, or I'm able to go in and ask a question and get my answer fairly easily. Risk assessment tools are very useful. Charles will talk a little bit about this, but if I've got a particular scenario that I'm able to recreate, a digital twin sort of thing, but if I'm able to recreate a particular scenario and provide you with the guidance around what that means in terms of the risks that are associated with that scenario, suddenly applying the rules to me and my environment is much more easy. And then finally on this point, so readiness for RegTech. So RegTech here we mean regulatory technology. So what technologies are available for understanding and implementing regulation. And really in this context, we're talking about RegTech for regulators. So what technologies can be applied internally at a regulator to help them design, produce, and then monitor regulation and compliance, and ultimately support better policy making. So that's the sort of the contextual slide. Now we've got some examples. So here is an example that the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency uses. So they produce a big book of rules related to drugs called British Pharmacopoeia. And on this website that TSO built for them is an example of the time travel function that I was talking about. So a user on this website can go back and see at a particular point in time when those rules changed and what happened to those rules. So you could have a situation where you can compare the different versions side by side to help you track, but at least you know at a glance whether this rule has changed over time, when it changed, and you're able to assess what the impact of that change was. Particularly useful if you do need to go back and see what the rules were at a particular point in time. We also have this on the main legislation.gov website, for example, but anything where rules change over time, we find this to be extremely useful for the end users. And then on the understand side, we've got e-learning. So we used an example here that we produced for the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency. And here they have a sort of a theory test kit app where you need to do your theory test, but you want to do a lot of practice before you take your theory test so that you can pass. And here we've produced an e-learning module that gives you scenarios where you can make that assessment yourself and you get your scores immediately back. So a little bit different to what are the rules that apply to me? It's more about how do I learn about these rules and how do I apply them either in a test situation or in a real life situation, let's say. But this app, is very popular. There's about 4 million users to date on this side, so we can access a wide what would you say, community of people who need access to this information, and we just need to find the right medium in which to be able to send that information over. And then we've got in Apply, we've got the risk assessment tools, as I mentioned, that the HSE produced. But I will, when Charles comes to that, he's got plenty to say on that. So I will leave him. I will tease that one for now. So I just wanted to talk through this innovation pathway that we've put together. This is really from a regulator's point of view. So we've tried to map out the relevant activities a regulator is concerned with. So that's rule drafting all the way through to adoption. And then we've tried to understand what it means when there's no kind of digitization activities, really. And this is the sort of column 0 there with all the PDFs on a website. And how do you step that through each of these sort of generations from, all the way through to state of the art. Now, various different regulators are at various different points on this journey. But what we're interested in is moving as many people from left to right as possible, because we believe the benefits of doing this are equal for the regulator and for the citizens themselves. And that gap that we described, and all that plethora of regulators, that gap we described there is closed the more we can move to the right hand side of this diagram. So I won't take you through it in inordinate detail, but I just wanted to show you that sort of it starts with the drafting of the rules themselves. Can we move the rule drafting out of MS Word and posting PDFs to single source XML, designed like content and a content architecture? If you do that, you can then start using AI, artificial intelligence drafting tools to help you with your drafting of policy. So there's plenty of benefits there. But once you've done that, everything else kind of follows through, because you're able to consult in a much more digital first way. Your final rules become digital and can be passed straight through to the end users of these rules for automatic adoption, ideally. When you're publishing, we start adding taxonomy terms, semantic markup, and then we get to machine readability and small language models, where we start to unlock really the power of content as data. And then on the consumption side, synergy by design is the key point for me there, where we can, in that first diagram we showed of all the different regulators, we can start joining up the different regulatory regimes and have regulators working in much more synchronicity than is capable at the moment without a lot of manual effort. We can make this much more of an automatic process and much more of a data exchange scenario. And then ideally we lead to automatic adoption so that everyone complies with the rules automatically, would be obviously quite nice. So just in summary then, from my point of view, so the key principles for regulators are obviously understand the users of your regulation and put them at the center, and they're not always humans in this day and age. We're going to actively publish our regulations to make it easier for people to find, use, understand and apply. And we do that with a proper publishing process. And then we do more to help compliance. So we produce more tools, more guidance, more e-learning, and all of these things are possible if you've laid the foundations in terms of the content that you use. So that's my introduction, if you like, my overview. No one's got their hand up, so I will, see if the chat's got anything in there. No, we're good. Okay, so I will hand over to Charles, and you can hear from a bona fide expert.
Thanks very much, Alan. I feel that set the expectation of being a bona fide expert, but you'll be the judge of that at the end of this next 20 minutes or so. So good afternoon, everybody. Again, my thanks as well for joining us. So I'm going to give you a view from HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, taking up particularly some of the themes that Alan's introduced, particularly around tools and kind of getting information out to those that we regulate. And thanks, Alan. Introduction to HSE, for those who aren't so familiar with us. HSE is the regulator for workplace health and safety. So that's addressing risks and hazards that arise from workplace activity. Those affected could obviously include the employees, but can also include the public as affected by workplaces. So a lot of our work is around major hazards such as process plants. Those if where things go wrong would have a huge impact, but also looking at health issues such as stress. The 5 areas you see in front of you, the recently issued strategy for HSE for the next 10 years, and you can see some of those themes coming out, but now with a greater focus on things like net zero. And because HSE has recently taken on the role of regulator for building safety in the wake of Grenfell, we have that second one, which is around increasing trust that people have in their environment. It's interesting because that is a bit of a departure for HSE, because you wouldn't call a building a workplace. So this has broadened the remit of HSE's activities. And I would just say that fourth one is something we're very proud of. Great Britain does have the world's best record for health and safety. It's the safest place to work for any of the very tiny countries which perhaps don't have any industrial activity. So that's something we're proud of and we aim to maintain. Now, HSE is a bit unusual because we do carry out our own science activity, and for very good reason. The role of HSE is often described as being based around three pillars, 3 sides of a triangle, however you want to think of it, of around setting policy for how we're going to regulate HSE, regulate health and safety. Regulatory activity, that's our inspections, prosecutions, and so on. But the third pillar is evidence. Everything we do is based on evidence. And under the Health and Safety at Work Act, which formed HSE, there's part of that legal documentation which says that HSE can carry out its own science and research to support its own activities. So we do just that. We undertake research, we investigate accidents, and that feeds in to underpin everything that HSE does. Sorry, Alan, could you just skip back to the previous one? But part of that is now that creates such a wealth of knowledge that people wanted to access that. So part of what we do now is support private sector, support other government departments through the work we do. Some of that's on a commercial basis. At least we can help these other organisations bring new technology to market and so on. A lot of the work takes place at that site you see in front of you there, which is our Science and Research Centre in Buxton, which is where I'm speaking from today and where I work. So I'm not an inspector, I'm an engineer by background, and we have about 350 scientists based in that building in front of you, and it's situated on a 500-acre site where we can do quite exciting experiments. I always tend to say we could do the kind of things that people say you shouldn't do because of health and safety. So we are able to blow things up, set fire to them, and understand really how things can go wrong in industry. We've been doing this for over 100 years because even prior to HSE, these experimental sites were around the country, and we've coalesced into this one facility now. So our history goes back a long way. But as you can imagine, that generates an awful lot of knowledge through our reports, investigations, our research, and we sit on this wealth of knowledge, which we now realise is something which we need to better exploit. So thanks, Alan. Next one, please. And that's really the focus of what I want to talk about today. is exploiting the knowledge assets that we hold as an organisation. Now then, very important year for us. HSE was formed in 1974 under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And as you can see from the logo behind me and on the slide, this is now we're celebrating our 50th year. Something we're very excited about. The actual anniversary of full creation of HSE will be in January. So we have all these knowledge assets which have emerged from our scientific work, our investigations, and so on. And we're encouraged by government through the Government Office for Technology Transfer and something they've got called the Rose Book, which you may or may not have come across. As a government department, we're encouraged to make sure the knowledge we've got is accessible and gets out to the people we need it to get it to. Now, this can be done by making things freely available. Commercial exploitation is a perfectly acceptable route as well. And Alan's spoken about improving the way we can exploit this through documentation, through moving away from PDFs to more accessible documentation. And that's something we're working with TSO on. But I'm going to focus on these 3 areas particularly as 3 examples of how we are trying to help those that we regulate to comply and to have access to the knowledge that we have as a regulator. So thanks, Alan. If we go and look at training first of all. So this is the first way that we aim to get this information out. We've been running a portfolio of training courses for many, many years, 20, 25 years now. And this is still a growing aspect of what we do. Mainly done commercially, so people pay to access our training. We deploy this through in a number of ways. We kind of bundle up these knowledge assets, this information we have, into training packages that we feel are useful to industry and people who want to comply and learn more about different aspects of workplace health and safety. There can be very technical aspects, such as looking at disease regulations, musculoskeletal injuries. They could be more generic courses, like what does an inspector look for when he comes to workplace? Some of the courses are aimed at director level. What do board members or business owners need to know about health and safety in order to make sure their workplaces are safe and that they comply with regulation? We use different formats: face-to-face training, live streaming, e-learning, again, working with TSO. I'll talk a bit more about that partnership in a moment, and blended combinations of all of those. Our face-to-face training is very popular because most of that is delivered by our scientific experts. So people have very much a direct access to the experts who sit behind a lot of this information. We do use training partners as well, but those courses delivered by the first hand are very popular because people can ask specific questions and get direct access to the expertise. And we also run conferences, events, and so on, and work with partners such as NEBOSH to accredit the courses. So moving on, thanks, Alan. I'm going to talk about tools now. And then we do partner with TSO for much of this. It's a relationship which began several years ago. It was an open contract to find a partner initially to help us with our publications and books, guidance documents, to deal with the transactional stuff, printing them, publishing them, selling them, marketing them, and so on. But we developed that relationship into software tools, and that's really what I'm going to focus on here. So we had two tools that we used to sell effectively ourselves. Now TSO have picked up this for us, but the principle is the same. If we take an area such as stress, it's something which people in an organisation struggle to know how to tackle. But through these tools, we can share the knowledge we have in a format that people can then access and get direct, and we can translate that knowledge we have into an easy accessible form. So a lot of our tools are questionnaire based. They would be, the user has the ability to tailor the nature, the style, the feel of the tool to their organization, to use the same terminology as they would use internally. So it looks familiar to their staff, who would then complete the survey. Survey is carried out online. They don't have to download anything to their systems. Members of staff would complete the survey, cross-section of staff, and then the report is fed back to them in an automated form. So it tell them, when we're talking about stress, for instance, perhaps which sector, this segment of the organisation is most at risk. Maybe it may be kind of workers, or it might be supervisors, managers, whatever. Perhaps which site, if a multi-site organisation, is most at risk. And they get a template report fed back, populated with the data from their own organisation, and then based on the highest risks that have been identified, they get tailored advice as to what that organisation should then think about doing as a next step to address the things that have been highlighted. So, very popular tool. We do another one on safety climate tool. So it's a good starting place for organisations with safety to just look at what the safety issues are that they're being faced with. So very useful for organisations to get started, and it's all based on HSE's own science and therefore HSE's own policies and guidance. So it's a different way of getting that out to people. If we move on, please, Alan. So, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, so a lot of this has been covered. These are kind of screenshots from the stress indicator tool that you can see here. So very easy to access. Workers do it, and it feeds back to management. Okay, can we move on to the next one, please, Alan? This is the key thing. So hopefully I've described how this can benefit an organisation using these tools, so they can access HSE's knowledge and expertise, but we get benefits back to us as a regulator through doing this. So as a regulator, our challenge is reaching those organisations that we need to regulate. Big business is one thing, but I'm sure if there are other regulators on the call, accessing SMEs, small businesses is really difficult. Because inspectors don't really have the time to go to every individual business. They try and target their time when they have the greatest impact. But these tools are a great way of accessing smaller businesses. They're affordable. That means businesses can kind of get HSE's principles embedded. So reach is really important for us. These tools enable us to reach organisations that would otherwise be hard for us to engage with. Because the tools are based on HSE's own guidance, principles, and behind that, our own research, it means that it's a way of getting HSE's messaging and policies into organisations through tools such as these. But then here's the interesting bit, because we've now seeing a benefit which we hadn't really anticipated. So if you imagine all these businesses using the tool, and we're talking tens of thousands of organisations, if we're talking about the safety climate tool, each of which has got dozens, maybe even hundreds of employees completing these questionnaires online. Now picture that database where all of those responses are held. Now for us as a regulator, we can access that anonymized database and see in real terms what's going on out there in industry. We can cut that data by size of organization, by type of worker, by region, by location, and we can see how, where the broad issues are in industry, so that we can then adapt our approach as a regulator to target these areas that are being highlighted based on responses from real workers. We can also see the impact of our policies, because if people are using this tool, we encourage them to run these surveys annually, so they will see, for their own benefit, see how things are changing year on year. But of course, we can see how things are changing year on year on a much bigger scale. So it's one of those kind of golden moments, really, where we can see, as a regulator, as HSE, we can measure the impact of something we're doing. We can see how health and safety or stress management is improving year on year in individual businesses or across sectors. And this is becoming really important to us. We can benchmark the data for organizations or sectors. We can demonstrate the value of what we're doing. And we can then use that data to then modify our own policies and approaches to regulation. So that data feedback is a real benefit of using this kind of approach of software tools. Thanks, Alan. Going to move on to the third area now, which is regulatory sandboxes. But first, to introduce this discovering safety. This has all emerged from an award we got from the Lloyd's Register Foundation. They're the charitable organisation that own the Lloyd's group of companies, and they a lot of the profits from the Lloyd's group go to the Lloyd's Register Foundation, who then deploy it for more kind of philanthropic purposes. So we won a £10 million grant from them to find ways of exploiting data to improve health and safety across the globe, particularly in developing countries. That was the program. But one of the things that the way that work developed, we began to find an increasing focus on construction, clearly a hazardous sector right across the world. And it's a landscape that's evolving rapidly as the amount of data generated is increasing. If you quote figures around multiplications of data in the world, I'm sure you're familiar with them. But HSE, health and safety data is particularly interesting. We hold data ourselves as HSE. Companies hold their own data. Other governments hold their data. But if we could pull the health and safety focus data together, then we can begin to mine that and use it very effectively. And that's what this program was all about. And we have a body of stakeholders, all of whom are contributing the data into this program in order to get the benefits back out again. Thanks, Alan. So one of the things that's emerged from this is regulatory sandboxes. Now, this is an approach we're finding is really helpful as new technologies emerge. I'm sure those of you who are regulators are familiar with when you come across a new technology that's being used in your sector, which doesn't fit with the previous regulatory approach. You have it's something that's a bit disruptive, and you think, well, that's really good, and actually probably quite good for health and safety in our case. But actually, the way we regulate at the moment doesn't recognise that, or might even say you can't use that technology because it conflicts with the way we regulate. So there needs to be a way of evolving our regulatory approach to encompass new technology. And that can happen at different times. We come across new technologies, an inspector will see something in an industry and think, wow, that's new. Not quite sure how to approach that as a regulator. So we get caught by surprise by technologies. But other times we can see it coming and we can anticipate it. And it's perhaps we're seeing it ahead of industry. One thing we don't want to be in the position of doing is when new technologies emerge to be the regulator that says no. It's not good reputationally. It's not good for bringing new technology forward. If a whole load of investment has gone into taking a new technology from discovery through development, and it's about to deploy it in industry, and we say, oh, can't do that, health and safety, that's not a space we want to be in. So these sandboxes are a way that we can explore new technologies with those developing it, with us as a regulator in a safe space, so we can be open. The technology developers can be open, we can be open with the regulator as to how we would view it, and we develop an approach jointly through these sandboxes. We don't suspend existing regulations. We have this open, safe space. We're finding greater support through this from other government departments. There is now a Regulatory Innovation Office who are very interested in this approach. Some of our work supported by the Government Office for Technology Transfer. So we can bring together a regulator, we know how we regulate, we can bring together industry who are developing it and they know their technology. And together we can identify the challenges that they're going to face as this new technology comes forward. And maybe they have to adapt their technology to meet compliance. Maybe we end up having to adapt as a regulator, recognizing that this is a good thing to bring to market. And so we do this under a regulatory sandbox. Importantly, we make sure things like IP is protected and that nobody's going to be have a negative impact of engaging with this approach. Next one, please, Alan. So just quickly, 3 examples of these sandboxes. First one was called Industrial Safety Tech. This was for the construction industry, looking at new technologies coming into the construction industry. Think things like robotics, wireless sensors, using data to as part of a health and safety approach. Smart hearing protection that adapts to where you are. So given that a lot of our regulations are around PPE and fairly conventional health and safety, as a regulator, these new technologies kind of don't fit within the model. So this was a sandbox to explore those new technologies, how we can recognize them as a regulator as being good things, how to make sure they don't have negative side effects and so on. And so that was that first one. The second one, the Smarter Regulation Sandbox. Now this was for the benefit of ourselves as HSE, how we can improve our own approach to regulation using data and intelligence to make it easier to kind of to make our regulations more easy to navigate for users, more accessible, using smart technology, some of which Alan's spoken about previously. Now this third one is quite a new one. It's to again a sandbox approach, but to create a network of people with shared interests in industrial safety technology, safety tech. And by creating this network of people with a common interest, we can actually make it easier to trial new technology by having a whole range of stakeholders with different interests as part of the same network. So this sandbox approach is something we're finding very successful and as a regulator, and it's really helping us move forward and enable new technology rather than be an hindrance to it. Okay, thanks. So just to conclude, I'm going to unashamedly nick some of TSO slides, but really because we're on the same page with all of this, we're aiming for the same area. Now, these are the benefits to us for doing this. It enables us to reach organisations we couldn't otherwise, make our regulatory approaches accessible. We can measure the impact of what we're doing through exploiting our knowledge assets in this way, focusing on the regulated, and as we said before, reaching them. So there's lots of benefits back to us of doing this. And as I said, a lot of it's done on a commercial basis. So our finance director is also reasonably happy with what we're doing. And then the final slide is really just to wrap things up. Of course, this is the one that Alan spoke to earlier on, but just to reinforce this provides benefits back to those we regulate. We're very focused on supporting the people that we are responsible to as a regulator and closing that gap. Historically, I think there's been quite a gap between people feeling the kind of heavy hand of the regulator on their shoulder, and that forms a gap between them and the regulator. We want to get closer to those we regulate and have more, be closer to their needs, to support them, but at the same time deliver our mission, which is to keep workers and the public safe from their activities. And we can do that by working much closer with them. And this enables us to do just that. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope that's been interesting. And I think we're now going to move to a more interactive part of the session.
Thanks, Charles. I'm actually going to kick off straight away with a question. I may have come prepared. Is there any lessons you learned from the whole exercise that you've been undertaking recently, and anything you might have done differently?
Yeah. So yes, there is. I mean, perhaps add a bit more history to this. So all of this activity emerged from what was previously seen as a bit of a kind of a dark corner of HSE, where I've explained the science division, and then part of the science division was this corner where we did commercial work. We did things that were paid for, which a lot of HSE, actually, a lot of our colleagues kind of frowned upon. They said, we're not here to make money, we're here to be a regulator, we shouldn't be charging. That attitude and culture has very much changed. But this approach to producing tools, producing things which are useful to those we regulate, came from that commercial corner. which means we've done a lot of it kind of in isolation from the rest of all the organisation. From where we are now, seeing these benefits of the data now looping back to inform policy, what I would have done is work much harder several years ago to engage the whole organisation, because they're really just getting on board now saying, oh, we've got this new campaign coming out, this new policy to develop. How can a software tool help us with that? If we'd had those conversations several years ago, we would have a much broader portfolio of tools and actually be in a much better place now. So I think what I've learned is earlier engagement and actually kind of confronted some of that resistance much earlier on to show the benefits of what we now get.
Wonderful. Thanks, Charles. We have a question from Jack.
Well, a question for both of you, if that's okay. So I work for the regulator of social housing, and we are hosted on .gov.uk. So I'm sure some others might be. I was really interested in some of the tools that you were talking about, Alan, and whether you had experience of using those in the .gov.uk environment and what limitations there might be there. And Charles, I was interested in how far your work was driven by what you thought was a helpful way of doing it, and how far you'd involved your regulated entities in saying this is the shape of the thing that we would benefit from.
Okay.
You want to go first, Charles? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question, Jack. I mean, it's another result really of it coming from this commercial part of the science work that we do, because that is very much focused on the user. So if you kind of think of, so the broader work we do includes consultancy, bespoke research, bespoke testing, experimentation, which is of course all driven in a commercial world by somebody coming to us with something they want to do. So that part of HSE was already very tuned into what the needs of our kind of audience are, as it were. And these tools have come from that same place. So I'd say they have very much been driven by a user need. And that's where, even though some people think things commercially on a paid for basis shouldn't be what government's doing, it's actually very useful because people only pay for something that's useful to them. So actually, if we did produce something which wasn't useful, they wouldn't buy it. So it's actually quite a useful indicator. So I'd say yes, very much driven by what people need, but at the same time, everything we do has to fit with HSE's strategy and themes, which I put up at the start. So we don't, for instance, get drawn into areas that aren't of interest to HSE. So it's kind of the overlap in the kind of Venn diagram, really, of things that are interesting to HSE and things that our users need, and where they come together is the sweet spot where we develop these things.
Yes, and so on the sort of commercialization bit, so I worked for the Financial Conduct Authority. It's how I got to know TSO originally, and there it's not taxpayer funded, so it doesn't take taxpayer money, but obviously it takes it from its regulated community, pay for it. And while the website, the handbook, FCA handbook website, has to stay free to use, we were able to commercialize the data aspects of the content and say then to the financial services firms, yes, we've spent a lot of money, the FCA, have spent a lot of money on this new handbook website, but because we've done that, we're able to recover some of that cost, so it's not impacted or covered from your fee. So depending on the regulatory community you've got in play, there are definitely options where you can say, yeah, it's not free to do it, but we have a way of making it viable. And then on the .gov.uk question, Jack, that you asked, yes, we do build on .gov.uk, and you can be in the domain, but you don't have to use the architecture. So if you go onto legislation.gov.uk, that's one of ours. That's obviously a .gov.uk site. There's zero .gov architecture on that website, and we have a few other examples we can use, but we can also build within the .gov.uk architecture as well, depending on the appropriate solution for you there.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the back of that, actually, because HSE, we have to put this up on .gov.uk as well. At the moment, we have a concession. We do have our own website for our science work, so we have a separate website for that where we have a bit more freedom. And I think we're on a limited time as to how long we'll be able to retain that for. But it is actually one of the advantages of working with an organisation such as TSO, because they can do things that we couldn't. So they can kind of promote the tools and do things through their website and through their contacts outside of what we do, and it obviously not free reign with this. Obviously, there's got a bit of constraint around that, but it does allow an extra dimension of what we can do by working with a partner organisation such as TSO.
Thanks, Charles.
Other partners are available, I should probably say, but
of course, naturally.
We do work with TSO.
Louisa, I think you're next in the queue.
I am. I'm always keen. I'm conscious to give the members an opportunity, so I'll be brief. I was really struck. Thank you both. It was fascinating talk through. I'm interested in particular that innovation pathway that you shared, Alan, and about perhaps insights from the earlier stages, from working with regulators, that stepping through from basic to advanced. I'm always interested in how you get started. So it'd be great to hear something from the kind of earlier stages of work.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Great question. So the very, very early stage, like stage 0.01, would be take a very small piece of your content that's locked up in a PDF, expose it, transform it, and then see what it looks like, see how the architecture fits, and then build from there. So really the very smallest iteration you can think of, done on a proof of concept or a minimal viable product basis, and away you go. And that is a very comfortable kind of process that you can step through, because you can predict at any time how much content you're going to migrate and how far you're going to go along. Having said that, there are some wild and adventurous people who just say, right, we're not going to step through anything. You're going to go and take us straight to the right-hand side as quickly as possible, which is also achievable. But obviously, it's a bit riskier if you're a bit worried about the outcome there. David, do you have a question?
I do, thank you. Yeah, thanks to you both. That was very interesting. A question for you, Alan, again, and it's on the innovation pathway. I'm from the Civil Aviation Authority, and I have to admit that I think that improving the accessibility of our regulatory information, better enabling stakeholders to use it, is one of our key organisational challenges, and we've got some sort of fairly rudimentary sort of work going on to try to address that. With the innovation pathway, it seemed to me in order to sort of leverage the full benefits of regulators maturing through that, and I think realistically for us to be able to afford the latter stages of it, would really require some sort of collectivization of effort across the sector. Is anybody currently in the frame for managing that? And people mentioned the Regulatory Innovation Office. I wondered whether that was one of the things that they might be able to look at potentially.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the Regulatory Innovation Office is obviously brand new, and is a little bit looks more about the regulation of innovation rather than innovative regulation. Enabling. If that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. Whereas we've got the Smarter Regulation project done through the Department of Business and Trade, which is looking at the hard graft of joining all of these different regulatory sources together to come up with a portal where you can answer your question. So I think probably it will end up being within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, because this seems to be where e-government, the sort of current government, wants to put all of its e-government resources in there. But currently it's being looked after by the Department of Business and Trade. And I can share with Louisa the contacts there if you want to reach out to them. I know they would be very interested in having as many regulators participate as possible. So I'll talk to Louisa about how we share those details around.
Thanks very much.
Yes, Louisa.
I was going to come back in. I was interested, Charles, in you touched on the sandboxes, and apart from the dangers of using laptops in sandboxes, which is your image suggested, but I'm interested in the regulated experiences of those, and you touched on that a wee bit, but it'd be really interesting to understand what the kind of experiences of those that have participated have been, and any, again, unintended kind of benefits or considerations and interventions that have flown from that. It'd be really great to get an understanding about their experience.
Okay, I'm gonna have to confess the sandboxes of the three areas I spoke about is the one that I'm least involved in on a day-to-day basis. But I will So a colleague of mine is on the call, Gemma, who may wish to join in this answer, but while she thinks about that, yeah, my understanding is the regulators who have been involved have all found it very helpful. I think any regulations moving from a place of being the kind of, the headmaster marking people's homework to being a place where we need exactly that. We need to work together more. And sandboxes are exactly that environment where people can be open, talk openly, and that's as informative for a regulator, because the regulator doesn't hold all the answers. That's always been part of HSE's approach to regulation since it was formed 50 years ago, is recognizing that actually those in industry know much more about what they're doing than the regulator does. So these sandboxes are a mechanism for getting that two-way conversation going without the kind of the worry or the concern that often organisations have to get involved.
Yeah,
you don't have to, Gemma, but if you want to add to that.
Thanks, Charles. No, I think that was spot on. But what I will do is I'll just put a link in the chat to the final report that came out of the first sandbox that we did. So the world's first regulatory safety tech sandbox, and people can read for themselves. So there's recommendations in there that we considered as a regulator, and there's also in there the the benefits that technology companies and the mentors found in each of the projects.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Thanks.
Jack, I think you're next in the queue.
Well, I was going to say, I've asked a question, so does Claire want to go next?
Okay. Claire, over to you.
Hello there, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Hi, okay. So Claire Bartley from Ofqual. It was just about conveying complex information. So it's really to you, Alan, I guess. We've spoken about the unexpected advantages of collecting data and what that can bring, but some of the information that we have to convey can be quite complex and obviously quite nuanced. So it's just getting an insight really as to what you found to be some really popular ways of actually conveying information for the end user to more easily understand.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the two elements for that are making it discoverable in the first place, and the complexity can arise from you needing to go to a variety of different sources to understand the full picture, potentially sometimes, and making sure that you're signposting and linking or incorporating or interweaving that content in the correct place. That can be done behind the content with the code that you put in behind the rules themselves to say this rule relates to this rule, or it covers this topic, or has this attribute to it, and you can start connecting it together so that you deliver all the content that's relevant to the query in one go. And then when you want to understand that, that's when you can then line the guidance alongside that particular query. So if you say the complexity of this query is in mashing this all together, we've done that. Now, to help you understand it, here's some guidance that we can put in the correct place with the correct pieces of guidance, not reading a 40-page PDF, but here are the sections that are relevant to you, with a bit of e-learning, with an app that you can download or to test yourself or whatever it may be. And you can then build your sort of tools and resources to sit around that to help with the complexity, because what we're not going to do is simplify the complexity. We're not doing that. We're not interested in simplifying regulation. It has to stay complex, but the tooling and the way that you turn the content into data supports the understanding of that complexity and making sure that you can gather all of this content together in hopefully a single place, a single position to answer the query that you've been presented with.
Okay, that's brilliant. So it's really structuring. Make sure you do your planning and your structuring, and yeah,
it's
okay,
content
your
architecture.
pathways.
Exactly, content architecture.
That's a good term.
Content as data, interlink everything properly, and that's not just with you as your content, but with other regulators that are relevant to you as well. And to David's point, start interweaving everything together, and then you've got a very powerful position for the end user to be able to understand what's going on.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Jack.
My question was just going to be, I wondered if you'd, or any of the firms you'd worked with, had evaluated the effect on regulatory compliance, because some of this feels intuitively like it'll generate better understanding and therefore better compliance. But I just wondered if you'd had any data on that.
Yeah, I'll throw it to Charles in case he's got any. But from my experience at the FCA, it's a very interesting one, because we were measuring usage of the FCA handbook before and after we transformed it. And to say that people are spending less time on the handbook might not be a sign of improvement. They might have a really bad experience, a worse experience, and come off the handbook sooner than they otherwise would, or they might be spending more time on there, which could also be interpreted as a good thing because they are spending more time understanding, or also a bad thing because they are spending more time, trying to find what they're looking for. So very, very difficult to measure success. So what we did and what other of our clients have done is ask a question and get empirical data from that. So that can be a net promoter score, for example. So we did this at the FCA. We had a net promoter score for the old handbook of about -51. And our first net promoter score of the new website was -11. So we got a 40-point shift up in the correct direction of travel. Now, that doesn't help you with compliance. Then you go and have to talk to the supervisory team and say, the tools that you have here, you get feedback from your supervisors or your inspectors, whoever it may be. So I don't think there's a single way to measure it effectively because you get too many false positives in play. But you definitely need to think about, before you make these changes, what are we going to measure? How are we going to demonstrate that we've made these improvements? And then you take those measurements again over time. We used to do it annually or whatever, to see that you are making those improvements. But how you measure good compliance can be quite a varied thing. Charles, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for us because in HSE world, compliance for us isn't. I don't know, it might be familiar. So HSE's approach to the regulation isn't you must do this. We have what we call a goal-based approach. So we don't tell people what to do. We say to people, well, do you know what risks you carry? Have you evaluated them and what you're doing about them? And so the onus is on the what we call the duty holder, the owner of the business or the person responsible, to do the work themselves and to own those risks. Our inspectors go in and just say, well, have you been through that process? So it's harder to. So compliance is a bit of a nebulous thing to measure. What we're really interested in is, are people taking the right kind of action, taking their challenges seriously? So actually, use of the kind of things we've been talking about today is a really good indicator of that. If an organisation has engaged with a safety climate tool or stress indicator tool, or it's come on our training courses, that tells us that organisation is doing something about the risks they have, and that to us is compliance. So compliance is an absolute minimal baseline. We're interested in people doing more than just complying, but actually embedding safety as a part of their core culture, and all of these things are indicators of an organisation doing just that. So it's not so much an indicator of compliance, but it's an indicator of of organisations doing the things we want them to do. And that's what we're after, really, and it is absolutely something we can measure then.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Alan, and thank you very much, Charles. A real pleasure. It's such an insightful session. Thank you so much for your contributions. And I've take away that I share a significant birthday with HSC, which I'm delighted to know about. That'll help. 74 was a very good year, a vintage. Right. Thank you to everyone. I'd be grateful if you'd share your virtual appreciation for the time today. We're just hitting time, but just if you are interested and actively engaged in innovation of regulation, 2 sessions coming up from the Institute that you may be interested in. Our Digital and Tech SIG will meet on Monday, the 25th of November, quite soon. It's in person at CQC in Stratford. Do get in touch if you'd like to participate. There's limited attendance, but there's still availability. And also online, the final in our AI and regulation series with Deloitte, which is on Wednesday, the 4th of December. So thank you very much, and pleasure to have your time today. All right, see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.